start recording here. All right, and next final step, I will share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? Any yeses, Emily?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Wonderful. Okay, so welcome so much, or thank you so much for being here. Welcome. My name is Jane Lyons, and you are here at Montgomery for All's September meeting, which will be a smart growth advocacy training. So wanted to have people get started by introducing them. Oh, I hear a little bit of feedback. If people could go on mute, and Emily, if you could mute people who have background noise, that would be great. So if we could get started by people putting your name, pronouns, any relevant groups that you're affiliated with, and where you live into the chat. So we have a lot of people here, so we won't be able to do introductions from everybody. So feel free to drop that in the chat. And then I am going to try another fun new thing, which is polls. So the first poll question I'm going to ask is, how would you rate your knowledge of policy making in Montgomery County? So we have 5 options. You know nothing at all, you know a little bit, the basics of how local government works, pretty knowledgeable, or are you an expert advocate? Oh, it looks like I have on that people can only chat to me. So let me change that. So now everyone can chat with everyone publicly and privately. All right, give a few more seconds for people to answer the poll question. Looks like 90% of people have voted. I will end polling and share those results. So it looks like we have a pretty nice bell curve here. About 50% of people feel like they know the basics of how policymaking in Montgomery County works. We have a few people, 2 people who are expert advocates. I'm guessing that might be George Leventhal, one of those. And a few people who don't know anything at all. And this is an advocacy training that's going to give you the basics. And we're going to talk about some things that were surprising to me putting this presentation together as somebody who would describe themselves as more of a pretty knowledgeable or expert advocate. So I think that this will be a training that everybody can learn something new from. So let's see. I'm going to stop sharing those results, and then I'm going to ask our second question, which is more of just a fun question. And what is your favorite way to get around in Montgomery County? Are you somebody who loves to walk everywhere? Are you a fan of scooters? Do you just love driving? Or do you love sitting on a train or a bus and watching the world go by? I'll give people a few seconds to vote. I didn't even think about what I would say, but usually my answer for what my favorite way to get around is biking downhill. Is the best way to get around. Worst way to get around is biking up a really steep hill. All right, looks like most people have voted, so I will share you the results. And that's actually really interesting. I wouldn't have thought that people's favorite way to get around was walking, or for that matter, that their second favorite way to get around is driving with all of the traffic that is so synonymous with Montgomery County. Thought more people would have liked trains. So interesting icebreaker question. Okay, so now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit, I'm gonna go over the agenda for tonight. So I'm going to give a brief overview about who the Coalition for Smarter Growth is, who is Montgomery for All, and then we're going to get into really the meat of the presentations, which is talking about first, what are the parts of government, the very basics, how does the policy making process works, and how can you participate in it. And then at the end, we'll have a general Q&A for any of your questions that have not been answered throughout the rest of the presentation. So there will be a chance to ask questions at the end of each of these sections. We strongly encourage it. And Emily, if you're able to, Emily is Coalition for Smarter Growth's comms manager who's helping me out tonight. And if you would be able to bring up if there's any questions in the chat that I miss or that any of the presenters miss, that would be super helpful. And if you could also put a link in the chat too after people are done introducing themselves to the advocacy manual, that would be awesome. So as I just mentioned, the advocacy manual, inspired by the Audubon Naturalist Society's conservation advocacy trainings. We have put together a Montgomery County Smart Growth Advocacy Manual that focuses a bit more on the housing, land use, and transit issues in the county. And so we're going to cover the main points in that advocacy manual, but there's a whole lot more in there. So Emily is going to put the link in the chat. And this says that you should have received a copy in the RSVP reminder email. That's not true. I will send out a thank you email tomorrow that will have a link to the advocacy manual so you can continue learning. So the Coalition for Smarter Growth, we are a regional advocacy nonprofit, and we were founded in 1997. As I mentioned, we work on the interconnectedness of housing, land use, and transit issues. And our vision is for a network of walkable, bikeable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities in the DC region. And we believe that that's the most sustainable and equitable way for the DC region to grow and to provide opportunities for everybody. So recently in Montgomery County, we've advocated for and won campaigns related to bus rapid transit. The Purple Line, although that's hit a bit of a rocky part, we still think it's going to happen though. And accessory dwelling units. And there are a lot more campaigns that we're working on now, which I'm also happy to answer questions about. And so Montgomery for All is a project of the Coalition for Smarter Growth. I am the Coalition for Smarter Growth's Montgomery County organizer. My title is Maryland Advocacy Manual. And we right now have a campaign for Thrive Montgomery 2050, which is Montgomery County's update to its general plan. And the general plan looks at how and where we're going to grow for the next 30 to 50 years. And it's going to set the work plan for the planning board, as well as the policy agenda for the next several years for the county council. So for this update to the general plan called Thrive 2050, we're organizing Montgomery for All, which is a more grassroots group. And it is advocating for a general plan that paves the way for a more equitable, more prosperous, and more sustainable future. We have a platform of 10 things that we want to see included in Thrive 2050. This includes more housing options, protections for vulnerable communities, ways to provide equitable, safe access to amenities, and a world-class transit network. So a lot of what we're pushing for is centered on reforming land use and housing as the best way to move forward locally on building a greener county and a more equitable county. We've really been trying to focus on, in the future, breaking down the East-West economic and racial divide that exists in Montgomery County. And we've been having a lot of conversations about why that divide does exist and how going forward we can learn from that past of racist land use policies on the local, state, and federal level, so that we can move forward and build that more equitable, prosperous, sustainable future. So we've been having monthly meetings. This is our September monthly meeting. And next month's meeting in October will be a testimony writing workshop, so you can continue learning how to be an involved citizen. And then November will be the planning board public hearing for Thrive Montgomery 2050. And if those words don't mean anything to you at this point, that's okay. That's what this training is for. So tonight we have three great presenters. One of them is me, and I'm really excited that I am joined tonight by George Leventhal and Julio Cerón. George Leventhal is currently the Director of Community Health at Kaiser Permanente of the Mid-Atlantic States. And he is also a former Montgomery County Council member. So he is a seasoned elected official in Montgomery County. He knows how this process works, and I'm really excited to for all of you to be able to ask him questions about, okay, that's what how the process is supposed to happen, but let's talk about how it really happens. And then the other person who will be presenting tonight is Julio Cerón, who had a bit of a difficult time joining, so he is on the phone. So we'll see if there are any challenges with that, but hopefully we can still move forward there. And he is a former Montgomery County Council staffer, so he's also somebody who's been inside that policymaking process and knows how this works. So, any questions before we get started? Let's see, try to open up the chat. See if anybody has any questions. Also, feel free to take yourself off mute if you have questions. This is not us talking one way at you. This is a two-way conversation. But if there are not, then we will move forward to talk about the parts of government. So I will hand it over to Julio, if you are there, Julio.
Great. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Yeah, no worries, and apologies, folks. I wasn't able to join via video, so you'll just have to bear with me, and apologies if there are any mic issues.
Don't fault Julio for that.
All right. Well, I'm happy to be here. As Jane mentioned, I'm a former Montgomery County Council staffer. I used to work for my Councilmember Tom Hucker, who represents District 5. And so just wanted to give you all an overview of what the Montgomery County Council is. So it's comprised of 9 members. 5 of those members are elected at the district level. So as you can see in the map, there are 5, and they're not gerrymandered as most congressional districts are, but luckily at the county level, the districts look much more together. And so we also have 4 at-large members who are elected by the entire county, not just the folks who live in that particular district. And this, folks have probably been watching closely or have heard at least about some ballot questions this year about changing the county council membership, either by removing at-large members entirely or adding 2 additional district level members. And so obviously that's a question that voters will decide later this year. So elections, council members are limited to serve 3 consecutive 4-year terms. After the 2016 election, there was a ballot question there which limited the number of terms that a council member and county executive can hold from limited to 3 4-year terms, so 12 years in total. And obviously, elections take place every 4 years. It's what we call sometimes the off year, or also the midterm years. So when we elect the governor in Maryland, as well as our state legislators, we also elect our county legislators as well. So this year, there won't be any county council elections, at least. There will be 2 Board of Education races on your ballot. And the responsibilities include approving all laws, regulations, as well as the budgets. And so these things obviously affect every one of us on a daily basis. I think there's oftentimes a obsession with federal politics, whereas local politics is something that affects you every single day. Essentially whether your street gets paved, how frequently a bus runs, among other things. The council also exercises exclusive power over land use decisions, which includes the general plan, which, as Jane mentioned, is being updated by the planning board and will at one point come over to the Montgomery County Council. So we can move over to the next slide. So these are the current Montgomery County Council members. So as I mentioned, there are 4 at-large members who are Will Jawando, Hans Reamer, Gabe Albornoz, and Evan Glass, and 5 District County Council members. That includes Andrew Friedson, who has the Poolsville to Bethesda portion of the county, Craig Rice, who has the Germantown, Clarksburg, Damascus area of the county. Councilmember Sidney Katz, who's also the current council president, has the Rockville, Gaithersburg area. Councilmember Nancy Navarro, who has the only Wheaton, Laytonsville area. And Councilmember Tom Hooker, who is also currently the vice president, who has the eastern portion of the county, so everything from downtown Silver Spring up to the Howard County line, essentially around Route 29. And so those are who were elected in the 2018 cycle. The next council elections will be in 2022. All right, so the next slide, we have the Montgomery County Council Committee. So each committee has 3 members, a chair and 2 other members, and there are 6 committees, as you can see here. There's the Education and Culture Committee, which handled MCPS, Montgomery College, and also some of the adult literacy programs that the county also provides. And also these, I should also mention that these committees don't necessarily always meet as an individual committee, so oftentimes there'll be joint committee meetings with multiple 2 or 3 committee meetings put together. So the next committee is the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. So that's the committee that deals with taxes, property taxes, among other things, and obviously spending and government oversight of county agencies as well. Health and Human Services, essentially what the name says, deals with public health programs, also human rights. So I think especially now during the COVID crisis, this committee has been working a lot in terms of how to deal with the health aspect of the issue, and also how to make sure that members of the county, irrespective of immigration status, socioeconomic status, are also being served and assisted with other necessities. There's the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. It's also known as FED, and that committee deals with zoning, parks, and recreation. And the committee deals mostly with things that are also dealt by the planning board, so there's a lot of overlap. And then there's the Public Safety Committee, so that's what entails policing, litigation, so the courts as well, corrections, fire services, and emergency management. And lastly, there's a Transportation and Environment Committee. The committee deals with mass transit, so your roads, but also the environmental programs that the county has. So in climate change and the county's response to that at the county level, and among other things, water and sewer as well. And as I mentioned, oftentimes there are issues that require both or more than one committee. So they'll have joint committee meetings, so essentially be 2 or 3 other, or 2 or 3 committees meeting together as one committee to discuss the issue. So for example, there's the school resource officers, so that essentially be public safety and the Education and Culture Committee sitting together. All right, so moving on to the next slide, we have the Montgomery County Executive. So he is also elected, he or she is, I should say, is also elected every 4 years and is also limited to 3 consecutive terms, so 12 years altogether. And their main role is essentially to execute the laws that the council has passed, but the executive also has the additional responsibilities of issuing executive orders and regulations. The regulations oftentimes respond to some of the legislation that the council has passed and has more, like, essentially more detail in terms of how the law is enforced. And obviously can also provide input on legislative matters by essentially saying whether he or she supports the legislation before the council. And there are also a number of boards, committees, and commissions, sometimes called the BCCs. In those are essentially your regional boards. So the Silver Spring area has its own board, as does the Wheaton area, Bethesda, and Up County. And the executive appoints folks who are interested in applying. So it can be essentially just anyone who's interested in serving the community in that way. So that's essentially what the executive can do in terms of appointment of residents to those types of boards. And as you can see here, our current county executive is Mark Elrich. He was elected again in 2018. And so he's serving his first term in, again, can only serve a total of 12 years or 3 consecutive terms. All right, so I'll hand it over to Ms. Jane Lyons.
Great, had to unmute myself there. So now we'll talk about the planning board, the other significant body in Montgomery County government. So the planning board in Montgomery County is made up of 5 planning commissioners who are appointed by the council and confirmed by the executive.
Hey, Jane.
Yes.
I'm really sorry to break in here, and I didn't notice this when I looked at it before. The planning board is not confirmed by the executive.
Oh, well.
So under state law, the executive could theoretically object to the appointment of a planning board commissioner, but the planning board is entirely appointed by the county council.
Oh, and so what would happen if the executive objected?
It has never happened. I think his objection could be overturned by a supermajority of the council, but I'd have to look it up. I'm sorry, I didn't come prepared for that question. But it is not, the executive does not have a role and has not played a role in the appointment of the planning board.
Okay,
so
well,
that's been subject to change a few times under state law. Sid Kramer changed state law so that he appointed 2 of the 5 commissioners, and then when Neil Potter was county executive, he went back. When Neil Potter was county executive, he was a big advocate for the county council, and so he went back to the state legislature and changed it back. So I'm sorry I didn't notice this before, but that sentence is in error. The planning board members are not confirmed by the executive.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, and that's why it's great to have you here. And that does sort of lead to one of the interesting things about Montgomery County politics is, from my reading, it seems to be that throughout the modern history of Montgomery County, it's always been this sort of push and pull between the council and the executive over power for control over land use issues. And right now it's very much in the council's hands to oversee the planning board and to make the actual big decisions on these land use issues. So that is just yet another way in which the county executive is not involved in land use and planning issues. So that's very interesting. Thank you so much for that correction, George. We'll make sure that the advocacy manual is also corrected if it has the same error. So the planning board members, when they are appointed by the council and not confirmed by the executive, they serve staggered 4-year terms, and they're limited to serving a maximum of 2 full terms consecutively. Yes. So the thing to know about the Montgomery County Planning Board is that it's actually a part of this really interesting larger public entity called the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, which has the infamous acronym MNCPPC. And as soon as you can say that 5 times fast, you can rate yourself as an expert advocate. So MNCPPC is a bi-county agency made up of the 5 members of the Montgomery County Planning Board and the Prince George's County Planning Board. So together they are the Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission Board. And there used to be a lot more planning that happened with in conjunction with Prince George's. Like, for example, Montgomery County's first general plan was made in conjunction with Prince George's, and that was called On Wedges and Corridors. So that has not really continued into the future. With the current update to the general plan that we're doing, we are not doing that in conjunction with Prince George's. But there are still things that the board will do together. For example, Governor Hogan is proposing to widen the Capitol Beltway, I-495. And so when the planning board makes decisions about that and has discussions about that, because it's an issue that affects both Montgomery and Prince George's counties, because the Beltway goes through both of those counties, they will meet together. So that's an example of one time when both of those boards meet together. And so the responsibility of the Montgomery County Planning Board is to plan for how the county grows. And in the case that we were to not grow for that as well, they review development applications. They approve those applications or tweak those applications. They advise on housing, land use, and transportation issues, which is why they're especially relevant to smart growth advocates. And I can't, because of the way my screen is, see what it says. They oversee which issues. Oh yes, they also see the Montgomery County Department of Parks and Recreation. So Montgomery Parks and Montgomery Planning are the two agencies that are overseen by the Montgomery County Planning Board. And we have a great picture here of the current 5 planning commissioners. So we have from left to right, we have Partop Verma, who was recently appointed, Tina Patterson, Casey Anderson, who is the chair, Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, who is the vice chair, and Gerald Sishi, who was the most recently reappointed. And one of the really interesting things to note about the planning board is that there cannot be more than, I believe it is two planning commissioners who have the same party affiliation. So, or there can't be is it, maybe George, you can correct me, they can't be more than 2 that have the same affiliation, or it can't be a majority, either Republican or Democrat?
No, it can't be more than 3. So
more than 3.
You may have 3 from the same political party, parenthesis, Democrat, and we do that now. Partop, Casey, and Natalie are all Democrats, but you cannot have 5 Democrats. And so when one of the 2 commissioners who are not a Democrat, when those seats become vacant, it's sort of a challenge in this heavily Democratic county to find people who are, you know, competent and professionally successful who are not Democrats. It's quite a challenge.
Yeah, and so Tina, I believe, is registered independent, and Gerald is, or Jerry is registered Republican.
That's correct.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing for a county that is so currently heavily Democratic. Of course, the county was not always so heavily Democratic, and that's sort of a relic of those times.
It's actually getting harder and harder as the Republican Party becomes more and more extreme.
Yes, especially now that President Trump is taking stands on land use issues and suburbia. So interesting national conversations there. But so this is the current Montgomery County Planning Board. They meet weekly on Thursdays. And so most of these commissioners are all part-time, except for the Planning Board Chair, who is, that is their full-time role. So any questions from, oh, that is not what I meant to hit. Any questions from the audience about the parts of the Montgomery County government, how the council is structured, what the county executive does, or how the planning board works? So feel free to put your questions in the chat or to just unmute yourselves and ask like that.
Hey Jane, this is Doris. So Mark Elrich is putting together a plan to address the climate emergency. And once he has that plan, how much power does he have to implement, or does he need the whole council to approve and legislation to occur, all that stuff?
That's a great question. And for something as complex as the climate action plan, I think that there is going to be a lot of different answers based on those actions. Some of those actions are just going to be, can just be regulatory and things that the executive departments can do on their own. But some of those things will require massive appropriations from the county council, which controls most of the budget process, which we'll talk about in the next section, or to create new laws, which will require cooperation with the county council. So it really depends on the specific actions within that plan, because it's so wide ranging. But I think it really depends. And there will definitely be some things that hopefully the executive department, the executive branch can get rolling on right away, because that's of course what we need to push back against climate change.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Tom, which says, are there other boards like the County Planning Board for other subject areas? For example, schools. And the answer to that is yes, there is a school board. They are elected. Because this is a smart growth advocacy training, we're not really focusing on the school board tonight, but they definitely wield a lot of power that I think George and maybe Julio know more about than I do, since that's a little outside of my policy area. But I don't know if there are any other sort of similar boards that have the same sort of power as the planning board and Board of Ed. Is that correct, George and Julio? Would you agree?
Well, power is a relative concept. I mean, you could say that the Board of Education is more powerful than the Planning Board, and the Board of Education, as you point out, is independently elected. I've just posted a link to the boards, committees, and commissions that are appointed by the county executive. There's also a dozen or so boards that are appointed by the county council, including the Board of Appeals, which also works on zoning and land use issues. And I can find those, but I'm about to make remarks. There would be a list of those on the county council's webpage. But there's like 86 boards, committees, and commissions appointed by the county executive, and I've just posted the link to those in the chat.
Great. We have another question from Dave Helms, who asks, isn't it the case that the planning board is highly independent? This is important with its influence on county land use. And then he dropped the other most infamous acronym in Montgomery County government, which is the Pedestrian Bicycle Transportation, oh no, I'm messing it up, Advisory Commission. I forget what that stands for. Traffic Safety Advisory Commission. There we go. And yes, it is the case that the planning board is highly independent in a way that is very unusual for planning departments. Usually there are planning departments that are a part of the executive branch in a similar way to the Department of Transportation or Department of Health and Human Services. It's really pretty unusual and specific to Montgomery County that there is a planning board that isn't a part of the executive department in that kind of way. Let's see if there's some other questions. How are the people chosen to serve on the planning board? Do they have to be nominated by a council member or similarly, or do they nominate themselves? Yes, people apply to be members of the planning board, and then the county council decides who they're interested in interviewing, and then after that, vote on who to appoint. Is there anything else that you would add to that, George?
No, you're handling this beautifully, Jane.
Thank you. Looks like another one from Richard Hoy. This is a question, other governments affect land use. That includes the feds for me. Oh, that's true, yes. There are a lot of other things that affect land use other than the Montgomery County Planning Board. So they definitely have to work together with a lot of different other agencies. Let's see, we also have one, to what extent do various Montgomery committees work together when their areas may overlap, such as zoning and versus climate change adaptation? Would you be able to answer that, Julio? You there, Julio? Oh no, I hope we didn't lose him. Oh, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Right, so the county council and the planning board, for example, don't work in silos. So the planning board will report to the county council or to the Fed committee about housing issues or parks that are being renovated soon. So there is some overlap and they do work together, but again, I think for the most part, the county council exercises much more power over a lot of these things than the boards, at least for the planning board and the Board of Education, for example. But there is some overlap. So for example, like housing, the planning board can approve more transit-oriented development closer to transit to address climate change issues, whereas the county council has more of a different role on issues of climate change and wouldn't necessarily affect transit-oriented development as much, but obviously the county council can rewrite the zoning ordinance so to make it much more beneficial or more attractive to developers to do something like that.
And how about, so that's the planning board and the county council. How about the different committees? Like you talked about before, they have like joint committee work sessions. How often does something like that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, the joint committee work sessions, from my memory, don't happen all that frequently. It's again like these a couple of issues where there is some overlap. So, like for example, I think they could potentially be like a Fed and T&E, is it the Transportation Committee, combined to discuss again housing and climate change and how the county can address climate change via housing issues. So stuff like that, but again, they don't happen all that frequently. I think much more frequently are the individual standalone committees meeting on their own. But once again, every now and then there's an issue that does require the attention of more than one committee at the same time.
Perfect. And Dave just put in the chat that an example of that is the Vision Zero Initiative Joint Committee. Another example of that is right now the county's growth policy is being updated. And so that is joint committee sessions from the Planning, Housing, Economic Development Committee and the Government and Fiscal Operations Committee. And then one last question that I'll answer quickly from Denise, because it's a great question. Does the planning board have jurisdiction over independent municipalities like Gaithersburg? So there are several municipalities in Montgomery County that have their own zoning, such as Gaithersburg and Rockville both have their own zoning. And I'm a little bit shaky on knowing whether or not the other municipalities do. Tacoma Park does, I believe, correct?
Do you want me to field that one?
Yeah, Tacoma Park does, right?
So there are 3 municipalities in Montgomery County that have land use and zoning authority and appoint their own planning commissions. And those 3 municipalities are Gaithersburg, Rockville, and Poolesville. There are other municipalities that have a supermajority requirement for a zoning change within municipal boundaries, and that includes Tacoma Park. So you can't change the zoning in Tacoma Park unless the city council agrees with you, or the city council. You would have to get if you're doing something over the objection of the city council in effect has a veto. But the city council in Tacoma Park does not adopt its own zoning or have its own planning commission or approve its own building permits or site plans or the kinds of things that the planning commissions do in Gaithersburg, Rockville, and Poolesville.
Well, I just learned something new, so thank you, George.
I'm a font of useless knowledge. I can't do anything with it now, so it's great. It's great to be on this panel. It's completely useless to me other than tonight.
Well, I will continue on with you so that we can learn more about the policymaking process with the county council.
Great. Well, thank you.
And there you are in that picture.
There's a bunch of old pictures. Yeah, they're getting old there. All right. So we're going to discuss how policy is made and how a bill becomes a law. And what I'm going to do is kind of take these slides. I'm going to try to perform like a jazz musician. You'll find a jazz musician takes a great standard like Somewhere Over the Rainbow or My Favorite Things, and then we'll just riff all over the tune and create his own tune. And I'm going to kind of do that with these slides as sort of the framework. So the basics here, as they say, a bill is introduced to the full council, assigned to a committee. A public hearing is held after introduction. The committee discusses and votes on the bill. The bill goes to the full council for a vote. A majority of the council is 5, so you need that to pass the bill, and then it goes to the county executive for approval. If the executive vetoes the bill, 6 votes are required to override the veto if passed and signed by the council and executive, or passed by the council over the executive's veto, the bill becomes law. Next slide. Resolutions are not law, and we spend a great deal of time at the county council discussing them, and they're often just hortatory. And there have been more of those in recent years. We used to sort of adhere to kind of a genteel approach that like our job is not foreign policy and we're not going to opine on the war in Iraq. And then Donald Trump was elected, and now pretty much every few weeks the county council is issuing thunderous denunciations of racism and injustice and President Trump's administration and supporting immigration. And so the council can opine on these matters and pass resolutions without the approval of the executive. Next slide. The county budget, there are two budgets. The capital budget, in which things are built and for which money is borrowed. So the capital budget tells you what libraries will be constructed, what schools will be constructed, what roads will be constructed by the county, although most of the major roads in the county are actually state roads. And then the operating budget, which is the year-to-year expenses for running the government, personnel, departments, programs, and capital budget debt service. And that's paying off the debt. Now, so this is an important distinction because the operating budget must be balanced each year. The county council may not spend more than it takes in taxes. The money that it borrows must be devoted to capital expenditures. The county, unlike the federal government, can't run an operating deficit, cannot borrow to meet payroll or pay operating expenses. So the debt that the county takes on is more like the mortgage on your house. It's a long-term capital debt to pay for physical infrastructure that is paid off over a long period of time. Next slide. So budget forums for the capital budget are held in June of the previous fiscal year. I'm not sure what that, I'm trying to understand what that means. The capital budget is planned a year ahead of time, and then the county executive submits the capital budget to the council by January 15th. It's actually every other year that a complete capital budget is developed. It's not an annual process. And then public hearings are held in early February in the years in which the full capital budget comes before the council. The council can consider amendments to the capital budget pretty much at any time, but the full capital budget is every other year. And operating budget forums are held by the executive branch in October, and then the county executive must submit the proposed operating budget to the council by March 15th, and then the council holds its hearings in early April. Under the county charter, the council must adopt its budget for each fiscal year by June 1st. It generally does it in the first week of May, pretty much every year. And then the fiscal year for Montgomery County begins July 1st. Next slide. Zoning text amendments. So let's just talk about what the zoning code is. The zoning code is county law, but unlike the bills that I discussed earlier, it is not subject to the approval or veto of the county executive. So the zoning code, which determines what may be built on a particular piece of land, as this diagram shows, some land is set aside as residential, some land is set aside as commercial, some land is set aside as agriculture, is under the sole purview of the county council as a legal matter. So the planning board makes recommendations on the zoning code and presents those to the county council. The planning board has huge authority of its own. So when a particular developer wants to develop a particular piece of land, that developer has to work with the planning board on the size and shape of the buildings and where they're laid out and what the site plan is. And that never comes before the county council. But a change to law, that is a change to the zoning code, must be approved by the county council. There are major efforts to rewrite the zoning code, as with the one that will accompany the general plan and the zoning rewrite that we did a few years back. And then zoning text amendments are small changes to the zoning code, which may address a problem that has arisen. It may come to somebody's attention that there's an error in the code, or more frequently, there's a desire for a change in the zoning code and it's not in between master plans. And so the council decides that a particular change to a zoning category will be made to facilitate a particular type of development. Zoning text amendments are not supposed to be site specific. So the county council tends to do a dance around the dialogue every time a zoning text amendment comes up. Everybody wants to know what gave rise to this. Who's the property owner? What does that property owner want on his property? And that's not supposed to be how zoning text amendments happen. They're not supposed to be specific to a particular slice of land. So, and not only does only the council have the authority to introduce a zoning text amendment, but as I mentioned before, only the council has the authority to adopt any changes to the zoning code, including zoning text amendments. Next slide.
I would just add in here before we move on that an example of a zoning text amendment, a lot of people on this call will probably be familiar with the ADU, accessory dwelling unit legislation that passed in 2019 that made it a lot easier to build an accessory dwelling unit on your property. And so that's an example of a zoning text amendment. It was a change to the zoning that made it easier to build an ADU.
Yep. Next slide. So the policymaking process at the planning board, next slide. Each year, the county council approves the operating budget for the planning board and planning department and Department of Parks, which, as Jane described, are all the same agency. It's all part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which people refer to as Park and Planning, and sets priorities for the work program. So people say the planning board works for the county council, and that's true. The planning board is the county council's advisor on land use planning and zoning issues, but it's also independent. The planning board makes its own recommendations to the council that the council then is not bound to agree with, and there are sometimes very sharp disagreements between what the planning board recommends and what the council ends up passing. So it's a very unusual and very close relationship. Members of the planning board are appointed by the county council, and the budget for the planning board is set by the county council, and the work plan for the planning board has to be approved by the county council, although it's developed by the planning board. So the planning board will come to the council and say, we think over the next few years, these are the priorities we ought to be working on. And the council can shuffle that around and say, well, actually, we'd rather you do this in this order. So it's a very interesting relationship. They're not co-equal entities. There's no question that the county council is elected by the people of Montgomery County and has much greater authority, but the planning board also is a very authoritative body and has a lot of influence over all of these decisions. Next slide. Well, this diagram speaks for itself. The entire county is subject to the general plan. As Jane mentioned, the very first general plan was called On Wedges and Corridors. It was adopted in the 1960s. The general plan was updated in the early 1980s, I believe, and now we're 40 years later, and we are going to adopt a new general plan. And then from the general plan, you have, on a more frequent basis, it's been 40 years since we've updated the last general plan, more or less, and on a 20-year or so time frame, they take up smaller plans for sub-areas, master plans, sectors of the county. And so these are all, and it's a constant process, 12 months of the year. The planning board is making recommendations. It rotates around the county. They recently, for example, acted on the Aspen Hill master plan. So they identify neighborhoods and areas within the county, and the view is they're in need of updating. It's been decades since they've been changed. The economy has changed, the demographics have changed, and so the planning board is always in the process of making recommendations to the county council on what the future should look like on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And then this year, this is why this whole conversation is so important, the entire vision for the county is before the planning board and will come before the county council next year.
I would just add to that about functional master plans. If some example of those would be the recent bicycle master plan that looks at where dedicated bike lanes and other bike infrastructure should be in the entire county and other bike policies. And now they're currently doing a pedestrian master plan. So that's an example of something that's a specific topic, but looks at the entire county.
Good. So the general plan is under discussion right now. And it is a very, very important document that lays out the county's vision for its own future. And depending on what it recommends in terms of density and intensity of development and how land is laid out, future zoning changes will be made. Zoning changes by law are supposed to be in conformance with the master plan, and the general plan is the big master plan. So the rewrite of the general plan that's now underway, as this slide says, will guide the planning department's work program and the county council's policy agenda on all issues related to shaping the future of Montgomery County: housing, transportation, land use, and environmental protection. Next slide. Okay, I'll just read this. Master plans are amendments to the general plan that provide detailed and specific land use and zoning recommendations for specific areas of the county. We already addressed this. Functional master plans, as Jane pointed out, address either a system like circulation, forest cover, forest conservation, bicycling, or a policy such as agricultural preservation or housing. Functional master plan amends the general plan, but does not make land use or zoning recommendations. And we've already addressed this. Sector plans are a smaller area than an area master plan.
For example, this is a picture of the currently ongoing downtown Silver Spring and adjacent communities plan. And it shows the boundary of where that plan will look at. So it's not necessarily the entire even greater downtown Silver Spring area, but really is looking at the core downtown area and those adjacent, like right next door residential areas. So questions. I think that it will be extra interesting to hear questions from this section. We already have a few in the chat, so I can read those, but also after we get to these questions, feel free to, like I said, unmute yourself and participate in the conversation. So Roy asked, does the planning board have authority to rezone a specific property within a master plan without council approval?
I'm sorry, rezone a specific property within a master plan without council approval? No. The only changes to the zoning code, the zoning code is law, and changes to law may only be made by people elected by the people of Montgomery County. So the planning board may recommend a change to the zoning code, but a change to law may only occur at the county council.
That's a helpful way to think about it.
Although, may I just follow up on that?
Sure.
So it is a change to a specific plot, a change in the zoning code?
So the planning board has to approve the site plan for a specific property. But if that property is zoned a particular way, R60, R90, the planning board may not approve development that is out of conformance with the zone in which the land is located.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I was muted. So Doris asked in the chat, can the general plan change if for some reason there are substantial environmental or economic population changes?
Well, ideally, all of these documents are regularly updated precisely to take into account demographic population changes, economic changes. But it takes decades to get around to it. I mean, this is a big county, and you go master plan, master plan, master plan. You look at the work plan. The work plan on a given year may include 30 projects for the year, which is a lot. But that's a tiny slice of Montgomery County. So it takes decades to get around to revising master plans once they're in place, and the general plan even longer. As I say, it's been roughly 40 years since we last took up the general plan. So it takes a long time. It's a major effort, and that's why this document, the general plan, is so enormously significant for the next several decades. They're calling it Thrive 2050, so that tells you the time horizon that they're looking at, and I would imagine it'll probably still be in place after 2050.
I'll ask a question that sort of builds off of that, and also hopefully you can answer with your experience. So after the 2008 recession, because Doris brings up economic changes, how did that change planning in the county? Did that affect anything? Was there a rush to figure out, like, how does this fit in with our planning? Or did we sort of just continue on as was planned?
Yeah, and so now I get to riff like the jazz player I promised to be. So look, I mean, so although I just said that the general plan is fraught with meaning, and it is, and the zoning on a particular piece of land certainly limits what you can build on your land. If you're a property owner and the zoning says that you can't build a building that's higher than 5 stories, well, then you can't build a building that's higher than 5 stories. That's the law. And you can't get a building permit for anything that violates the law. However, the plans are just plans, and council members puff out their chests and take credit for adopting a plan that will revitalize a certain area. Well, a plan doesn't revitalize an area. The thing that revitalizes an area is capital, is investment. And if the investment doesn't go there, it doesn't matter what the plan calls for. So the best example of that is the White Oak Master Plan, where over many years, and if Julio's still on the line, you may feel free to say, wait a minute, hold on. There has been this belief that because the plan calls for it, White Oak is going to become this hub of biotechnology research and development activity. And it is true that Washington Adventist Hospital has now built its new hospital at that site. And it is true that the Food and Drug Administration is at that site. But it turns out that medical device and drug companies don't need to be immediately adjacent to the Food and Drug Administration. They can be pretty much anywhere in an online world, and especially in a pandemic world. And so there has not been a rush of biotechnology companies to East County, White Oak, Silver Spring, even though generations of elected officials, including me, have said, this is going to be a great hub of biotechnology activity. It is not a great hub of biotechnology activity. Will it be in the future? I can't predict the future, but the fact that the plan calls for something does not mean that investment necessarily follows. And so the 2008 recession, had a greater effect on the investment climate than any of the planning documents, what they called for. Now, having said that, the Bethesda Master Plan did have a significant effect because we knew that investors like Marriott were, chomping at the bit to build really tall buildings, which they were then allowed to do under the Bethesda Master Plan. So where that a specific project, is in the works and you have to approve zoning that accommodates that specific project, it's much more likely that that will actually occur. But a lot of the lofty language about science and technology and research and development and how all of these jobs are going to be generated are political promises with the investment doesn't necessarily follow. We've adopted 2 master plans that call for, these thriving biotechnology hubs, one in the Great Seneca Science Corridor and one in the White Oak, I don't even remember what we call that now, science something. And neither one of them have developed into thriving and booming biotechnology corridors. And these passionate fights occur when the Great Seneca Science Corridor was before us. Johns Hopkins had very ambitious plans to expand on land that it had purchased, and the land that it had purchased was a very prominent farm along Darnestown Road, and the neighbors just lost their minds. I mean, they just fought us like you can't believe, but it's now, decades later. I guess that fight was in 2006 or 2008, something like that. It's well over a decade now. And the land is still a beautiful pasture. There's no development there. So the development that the neighbor fought tooth and nail would only have occurred if the investment made it happen, and there hasn't been sufficient private investment to build that second Johns Hopkins Biotechnology campus in the Gaithersburg area.
Let's see, our next question. Oh, I hear an echo. If people could mute themselves if they're not talking. Thank you. So the next question is from Denise, and she asks, after the new general plan is approved by the council next year, who proposes zoning text amendment changes? Planning staff, people, the council?
Denise is very smart because the answer is all of the above. So they can only be approved by the county council and they can only be introduced by a member of the county council, but the planning board can recommend them, and often the planning commissioner's recommendations come from their staff. They can also be requested by private parties. There was a lawnmower repair shop in the agricultural zone, and the lawnmower repair company said, look, we really need a zoning change so that we can operate as a business, even though we're not allowed to under the zone. And that individual went to a county council member who offered the zoning text amendment because the county council member was asked to by a member of the public. But they have to be introduced by a county council member. So they can indeed emerge from the planning staff or planning board, or from people, or from the county council. That your question is exactly correct in identifying those potential sources of ideas for ZTAs.
Andrew asks, and I think we answered this, who approves individual development proposals, the county council or the planning board?
So a specific landowner who is planning to develop his land in terms of a really major size and scope, I mean, a real big change to the land. I mean, an individual home also has to go before the planning board. The planning board, there's a lot of parties involved, okay? Specific properties are not subject to the approval of the county council for site plan or building permit. Okay, those specific functions, like if you want to build a second story on your home, that doesn't go before the county council. That would go before the Department of Permitting Services, which is part of the executive branch, which interprets the zoning code. If you buy a 10-acre parcel and you want to build 50 townhomes on that parcel, you'd need to submit a site plan to the planning board. And if it was allowable under the zoning, the planning board would still have to approve the design and shape and placement of the buildings. But if it doesn't call for a zoning change, that would never come before the county council.
That's really helpful, actually. I feel like that has provided me with some clarification. Last question that we'll do, and then we'll move on, and there will still be opportunity to ask more questions later. But Tom asks if we could say a little bit more about how the general plan is implemented. For example, who decides if a master plan is inconsistent with the general plan? What would the consequence be? Could someone sue? My understanding is that the general plan is not legally binding, but I think the question about who decides whether a master plan is inconsistent with the general plan is very interesting.
So can someone sue in Montgomery County?
Yeah.
The answer would be yes.
Yes.
Lawsuits can be brought on almost any ground and almost always are. And the law does say that zoning should be generally consistent with the master plan, but if you can go to montgomeryplanning.org and look up a master plan. The language is pretty broad, it's pretty general. Like, if you look at your horoscope on a given day, it's hard to read a horoscope that doesn't describe what might happen to you that day. An adventure is just around the corner. You are a person who cares about your friends. They're written in a way that they're broadly descriptive of anything that might happen to a Sagittarius, regardless of who that person is. And the master plan is not as broad and vague as that, but the master plan does not say precisely, and this is a big challenge for communities, because communities will engage in dialogue over the master plan, and they say, we have a right to know what our community is going to look like 20 years from now. Well, number one, they don't have that right. Nobody ever gave them that right. And number two, nobody knows what your community is going to look like 20 years from now. It's not possible to know what a community is going to look like. But that doesn't mean neighbors don't ask for it. So neighbors ask for a detailed diagram of precisely what this area will look like in 20 years, but nobody can provide that. And if you did provide it, and then 20 years later, the investment didn't happen, the gas station closed down, the mall was not successful, whatever it is, the county could get sued because the diagram or the architect's rendering or whatever it is that the county put out there doesn't resemble what actually happened. Again, on the question of could someone be sued, the answer to that question is yes. People get sued on this stuff all the time.
Sure, sorry, and thanks for that. I guess I'm just trying to understand what the stakes are with Thrive Montgomery, right, and the general plan. I'm trying to just understand in a more sort of granular way, like why does it matter? How does it get implemented? What's in the plan?
Well, I mean, here's one example. Let's get right down to cases. Zoning is an artifact of a time when segregation was legal and entirely expected. So the idea that residents of apartment buildings ought to live in a completely different part of the community than residents of single-family homes was a perfectly acceptable idea because it was consistent. It was a perfectly acceptable idea to the wealthy white people who were elected to office and passed those laws because it was fully expected that black people lived far away from white people. That was an accepted understanding among the entirely white elected policymakers. Now we realize that zones that segregate, zones that prevent the construction of apartment buildings in single-family neighborhoods are racist. And so the general plan could, for example, recommend that there not be single family zones any longer. The general plan might recommend that in any zone, you could build multiple units on a single lot, or you could allow duplexes or triplexes. There's a wide range of possibilities that are under discussion. That would be enormously influential in terms of the future changes to the zoning code and changes to area plans, master plans, and sector plans that would follow. That's one of the topics that will be hotly discussed.
All right, so I think we will have, like I said, more time for questions later. And thank you so much for that, George. And yet again, so glad that you are here. And right now we're going to talk about how you can participate in this process, which we've thrown a lot at you about how the county works and all the granularity of these processes, but there is a space for you in this. These people are elected or appointed to serve you and to listen to you. So it's really important that, that you get involved, especially I feel at a time when national politics can be so overwhelming and so big and honestly very depressing. It's very rewarding to advocate and work on issues related to the local level, where you can really talk face to face with the people who are making these decisions and tell them how you feel about it. So I'll talk about first, testifying at public hearings is one of the best ways to get your voice heard in front of a county council member, planning board member, government staff in general. These used to be held in person, but now they are happening online. They are required by law for bills, zoning amendments, master plans, and more. Almost anything that is happening is going to have a public hearing. And like I said, this is your chance to have a short 2 to 3 minute statement to talk about how the legislation or proposed policy is going to impact you, your community, your organization, the people that you represent. So testifying at a public hearing is a really powerful thing to do.
Could we go back to that photo just real quick, Jane?
Yes.
That's a really compelling photo, the one on top, because, and I know most of the people who sat on that particular panel, what happens is that those who take the time to testify before the county council are those who have developed a lot of expertise in a very arcane topic. The zoning law is very, very difficult to understand. And so generally, there are 2 categories of people. And what we see on this panel are both of these categories and 1 elected official. The first category, and that's the gentleman who's speaking, is elderly homeowners who want to prevent things from happening. And they learn about the zoning code in order to figure out how to prevent things that are not consistent with what the zoning code allows. The second category, and that's the woman with her head on her fist, are land use attorneys who get paid a great deal of money to be specialists in the arcane details of the zoning code. And then you have the elected official in the suit and tie, Delegate Carr, who's speaking up on behalf of his homeowner constituents who want to prevent things from happening. So the big challenge facing the Coalition for Smarter Growth, and of course, I don't need to say there's a pretty stark difference between the young woman in the bottom slide who isn't present on the top slide. You do see, I'm counting 4 non-white faces, including Delegate Carr, in a sea of mostly elderly, overwhelmingly white people, which is not representative of the population of Montgomery County. So what Jane and her organization, and I give them great credit for trying to do, is to empower people who are not in either of those categories, neither NIMBYs nor land use attorneys, and also not elderly, wealthy, white homeowners or elderly, wealthy, white land use lawyers. And that's the great challenge, is how do you participate in such a way that the plan for Montgomery County's future is actually representative of the input who will make up Montgomery County's future. Because by definition, people my age and older are not the future.
Yes, thank you for that, George. I think that's a really important point to make, and definitely something that is at the center of what I'm trying to do, is to get people who are not involved, and especially the planning process, involved to make their voices heard. But yes, so thank you for that. Another way to make your voice heard is to partner with existing groups, because it's difficult to every week monitor what committees are meeting at the county council, what public hearings are coming up. There are a lot of groups, especially in Montgomery County, who will help you do that and will tell you when the issues that you care about are coming up. So the Coalition for Smarter Growth and Montgomery for All is an example of that, but there are also a ton of other groups out there, like the picture on the right includes a lot of members from the Action Committee for Transit, the Audubon Naturalist Society, Jews United for Justice. There's a ton of groups out there in Montgomery County because we have a really, we have a segment of the population in Montgomery County that is very active. And so, so they can help you learn about how to get involved with the issues that you care about. And then, so I have written here that writing testimony, testifying, sending correspondence to your elected officials, signing petitions, these are all great ways during a pandemic to engage in virtual advocacy. You do not have to stop advocating for the things that you want to see just because we're in a pandemic. In fact, it's more important now than ever, probably, for a lot of the things that you probably care about. And I'll pass it over to Julio to talk a little bit about visiting an office.
Right. So one of my duties when I was in my former boss's office was to handle his calendar. So I took in a lot of meeting requests. So I know what it means to get a bunch of requests all at one time. But obviously, as your elected representative, it is their job to listen to you and your concerns. So that's something that you can do by scheduling a meeting and visiting their office. But as many of you probably know, they are your local leaders, so you can probably see them just randomly at an event or something. And obviously, not necessarily a time to have a long sit-down conversation, but it's obviously a time to maybe pitch an idea or something. But you can do is schedule a meeting by calling or emailing your council member's office, and that information is available on the county council website. So it'd be montgomerycounty.md.gov/council. You can select your council member, your individual council member, or maybe another council member on a committee that an issue is going before, and there you can also find the staff's information, and I believe many, if not all, of the council members' pages do let you know who is the scheduling contact. So when I was my boss's scheduler, I preferred to get meeting requests actually in the email just because it would be easier to keep a paper trail. I don't know if it's the millennial in me or what it is, but it's something you can easily do, and also you can obviously follow up if you haven't heard back from the scheduler by calling. It's a great reminder. Oftentimes we have a lot to juggle, but when you do get a meeting, it can be either with a council member or with their staffer for that issue. It is important to dress professionally and arrive early, especially if you don't know the building, if it's new to you, if you're taking public transit, for example. It's important to make enough time to get there on time. And it's also important to come prepared to, come prepared with asks, essentially. So talking points and handouts if you have those available, and if it is appropriate for the meeting. But it is important to let the council member know what you're looking for, whether it's that he or she vote in favor of or add something to the budget or vote in favor of a certain piece of legislation. It's important to have that final ask just so that the council member knows what exactly you're looking for and how to best serve his or her constituents. Obviously, be ready to answer follow-up questions. You're essentially presenting yourself as more or less a resident expert. So if the council member has questions, or if maybe you discuss this issue with your neighbors and they ask questions, be prepared to essentially have the council member ask those questions as well, and provide follow-up answers. Obviously, no biggie if you don't have the answers. You can easily email the council member and ideally their staffer as well to provide those answers. After the meeting, it's always good to send a thank you note. It can even be maybe like the day after, just to make sure that the council member and their staffer remembers your issue. It might even be a good thing to do, I think, to summarize the meeting or summarize your asks, again, just so that there's a paper trail, and that the staffer and the council member can easily pull back or go back to what your ask is, especially during the budget season. It's a very busy time for council members, especially so if it's during an election year. So they have a lot of things in their mind, so it's important to make sure that you provide as much information and make it as easy for them and their staffers to know what exactly you are advocating, and also what your asks are.
So I'd like to jump in on this point too. You cannot overestimate the importance to a politician of being paid attention to. The vast public has no clue, and this is why we're having this training, of what the county council is or what it does. And yet the effort that is involved in getting elected to the county council, the work, the stress, the sacrifice that you're away from your family, the abuse you have to take from people who criticize you, it's a very demanding job. It's a lot of psychic energy that goes into the job. So the very small slice of the public that actually pays attention to their work, elected officials appreciate that enormously, because most people have no idea what they do. And so I used to say that 75 emails on any topic, you can pretty much get anything you want out of the county council. So that the small number of citizens who are actually engaged and involved and paying attention have vastly greater influence than their numbers, because council members are frankly so grateful that someone knows what they do, understands their job, and pays attention to their work.
Thanks for that, George. And the two things that I will add to this, and I know I'll try to be quick with the rest of the presentation so we can get to questions before we wrap up. But number one is to not be too disappointed if you end up having to meet with a council staffer instead of the council member themselves. Council members are very busy people, so they'll often routinely be, 10, 15 minutes late to a meeting because they have very tight schedules. Although maybe that's not as true these days now that everything's virtual. And so often you'll meet with a staffer or start the meeting with a staffer to tell them the issue. Staffers are very important. There aren't a ton of them, although I haven't been on the inside of the council like Julio and George have, but my understanding is that, the staff is also important to convince, because they're who is helping the council member learn about this issue and who will remind them about what the person who they met with said. So it's not only important to convince the council member, but also to talk to the staff and to get to know them as well. And the second thing that I'll say is that in the advocacy manual that Emily put in the chat at the beginning and that you'll be sent tomorrow, there is more information about how to do this, including how to walk to these places when there are in-person hearings, what you need to have. Do you need to have an ID? Do you go through security? And all of those concerns. So I'll talk really briefly about testifying before the council. So to testify before the council, you have to sign up by 5 p.m. the day before an afternoon hearing and 10 a.m. the day before an evening hearing. Speaker slots fill up. So try to register as early as you possibly can, because Montgomery County, unlike some other places, does not take their public hearings until 2 or 3 a.m. to let everybody speak. They have an amount of people who are allowed to speak, and then it will be cut off after that. And in person, you were supposed to bring 15 copies of your testimony and submit it beforehand, although now you submit it virtually. Everybody has 2 to 3 minutes. During the pandemic, because there's so much going on, it's been 2 minutes. And if you wish to speak on more items on the agenda, you get 5 minutes. And so testifying before the planning board is pretty similar. Although I will say that the planning board typically does not stick to a schedule as well as the council does. And I also won't say that the council is super great at sticking to a schedule. And that's not necessarily their fault. Sometimes these issues take up a lot longer than is intended. And so with the planning board, my recommendation is that you plan to get there early and to stay probably a little bit later than you plan to, although that's gotten a little bit better with the virtual public hearings. So another benefit of going virtual. So you also get 3 minutes to speak before the planning board. Make sure to write out your comments, make sure that you reference the hearing date and the item number. They have item numbers, which is something that the council doesn't have. And submit your comments for the official record via email by 12 noon the day before the hearing. And for that, in person, you didn't need to worry about printing out copies of your testimony. So here are some tips for writing testimony. I'm going to go over those pretty quickly, or not at all really, because we are going to have an entire workshop about how to write testimony on October 15th. And you will receive an email tomorrow that will have the link to the advocacy manual. We'll also have a link to sign up for that testimony writing workshop. And we'll specifically be preparing to write testimony for the Thrive 2050 public hearing in November. So let's go to full questions, not necessarily about the parts that were just presented, but about anything about how to advocate in Montgomery County and how the policymaking process works. I saw before that there were a few questions that were related to this, but first I'll ask if anybody wants to take their mic or take their mute off and ask a question over the computer rather than the chat.
Yeah, I can, if that's so yeah, I had a question about like the best way to get other people involved, like how to approach them, and like maybe when and if you're not sure how they're going to react. So like I'm in a condo building, part of me wants to bring plan discussions up for the HOA, like I've done some testimonies and then some more voices to be better, but how do I bring that up without scaring them in a way that they're all going to oppose it because it might hurt their property values or something? Like, is there, I'm kind of afraid to bring it up because I don't want to make things worse, but I don't want to suppress participation either. So
can I take this one, Jane?
Yeah, please do.
I had a dialogue on Twitter with everybody knows Dan Reed, my good friend and yours, and he was suggesting that it's really important that younger people and YIMBYs kind of take over their homeowners associations and turn them around and make them more progressive. I would advise against that. I think everybody's discretionary time is limited, and I would encourage folks to devote their discretionary time as an advocate to discussions like this one. I think the effort that Jane is putting together is, the most effective organization at the moment advocating for more housing, appropriately placed housing, more density, more opportunity, and breaking up segregation in zoning. And homeowners associations are never going to do that. So, you can flail away forever at trying to turn your homeowners association around. And here's what happens is you get to like your neighbors because they're really nice, and then you end up compromising with your neighbors, and you end up becoming like a little politician yourself. It's like, well, I thought we could demand multifamily housing in this neighborhood, but Gladys, she's so nice. She looked after my dog when I went away, and she doesn't want it. And, you end up compromising with the people who which is exactly what council members do too. So I don't, this is my opinion, obviously, but I don't recommend homeowners association as the platform. I'm just laughing because the idea is so preposterous, as the platform for progressive change. That's not where you're going to get it.
No, thank you. That's why one of the reasons I've been hesitant. So no, it's good to hear that.
That's interesting, and I wish we had Dan with us to hear maybe the counter of that, but I think that you definitely raise a good point, George. Anybody else who wants to take their mic off mute and ask a question? It can be one that you already put in the chat as well. Carolyn raised her hand, so would you like to take yourself off mute and ask?
Hi, everyone. It's Carolyn. My question I put into the chat was for George. What is your vision for the county in 20 years?
Carolyn, it's so great to hear your voice, and it's so great to talk to you. And I'm flattered by the question, and that's not my job anymore, so I'm not going to answer it.
Touche. we miss you, George. Just wanted to let you know that some of us do care what you think the county is going to look like in 20 years.
Ask the people who hold public office.
I will. Thanks, George.
And tell them, more importantly, much more importantly, tell them what your vision is. That's a lot more important
That's what I
than
was
asking a
gonna
bunch
say.
of politicians what their vision is. Right.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
And I can answer what Montgomery for All's vision is, which is that, like I was talking about before, a county that does not have the East-West economic divide and racial divide, a county where everybody can afford to live in the type of place where they want to live, where you don't have to get in a car to go pick up some groceries to eat, or to go run to the corner store, or to find a restaurant or the coffee shop. A county that is green and sustainable. We definitely want to see the county meet its really ambitious goal of being carbon neutral by 2035. And yeah, a county where everybody has equitable outcomes and where your zip code does not determine your fate in this world. So that's what Montgomery for All is working towards, and that's our vision. But I digress. I will go to if anybody else would like to ask a question. Also look in the chat for what the questions were before. Let's see, I think Richard had asked about how can we incorporate goals for a percentage of residents having living wages, educational outcomes in public schools, health disparities, housing incorporated into the general plan. Julio or George, do you want to take that? Or if not, I'm happy to. Oh, you're on
I
mute.
have people complimenting me in private chat and I got distracted. So could you repeat the question?
It's for how can we incorporate goals into the general plan? Is that a place for the general plan?
Oh, it's huge. That is the general plan. That's what it is. It's all about goals. That you'll when you see the draft document, you'll see it. It's all going to be about environmental sustainability and smart growth and diversity and equity and opportunity and economic revitalization. It's all going to be very broad hortatory language outlining goals for the future. That's exactly what it is. It's a goals document. As I said before, like all planning is just planning. It doesn't tell you what's actually going to happen because nobody knows what's actually going to happen.
Any other questions from the audience? Aha, one in the chat from Nancy. Is there any way to bring this education into high schools? That's a great question. We want young people to get involved about developing some internships, etc. Yes, one of the things that I kept telling the planning department back before COVID was that they needed to be presenting about Thrive 2050 at high schools to hear what students in Montgomery County want to see their county look like in 30 years. So I think that there's plenty of room to do that in the local high schools, but I'd be interested, Julio, I knew you grew up here, if you think that there's a way that Montgomery County can better do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so in high school, we take what is called NSL, so National, State, Local Government. I took the AP version, and it was actually, I think, one of the main reasons I'm in government now. And I think one of the things we did actually was have a mock Congress. We also, I think, visited then State Senator Jamie Raskin up in Annapolis. So I think there is, I guess, some. And obviously, this depends on the teacher. So my teacher, Mr. Freeman, was actually I think his mom is actually very involved with the Women's Democratic Club. So I think he wanted to bring that real world aspect to the classroom. But I think, especially with the local issues, because again, they're not as attractive or they're not covered by the national media, folks tend to forget or not necessarily know what it's even about. So I think I commented to you, Jane, that I didn't necessarily know what urban planning was until maybe after I graduated college, because it's not something that you necessarily hear about on a regular basis and don't learn about in high school necessarily. So I think, especially because the players know each other, I'm sure the Board of Education can maybe encourage NSL teachers, for example, or civics teachers to teach folks more about, or students more about, how to get involved at the local level, what the planning board is, why certain communities look the way they do. I think especially now, George touched on this about redlining and how communities were planned to segregate folks on the basis of race. I think especially now, given the murders of black men in particular, high school teachers might be much more willing to discuss issues of race and why segregation or why communities look the way they do. So I think that's also a great opportunity for teachers to let their students know about getting involved in terms of advocating for the planning board or for the county council. I think, I don't know if you mentioned, but the public hearings are at a time when, if you're a high school student, you are in high school at the time. So most of them occur in the afternoon at around 1:30, I think it was. The more controversial ones are the ones that get much more interest are then scheduled for 7 o'clock, at least at the county council level. And so I think it's difficult, especially for folks like us who have to go to work or folks who are in high school to actually get involved and advocate before they're elected leaders. So I think the county or county council and planning board should look more at having public hearings later in the evening. I know, especially for county council members and commissioners, it's a little difficult to juggle having a family, but also having to attend your duties. So we'll see where that goes, especially now that it's much easier and folks are now having to rely on virtual gatherings and testimony. I think there might be some openness to doing stuff like that.
Thank you, Julio. And since we're 2 minutes past 8:30, I'm going to have my host privilege to ask the last question. But we can definitely continue this conversation, and feel free to reach out to me anytime with questions. If I can't answer, I'll put you in contact with somebody who can, Jane at smartergrowth.net. But my last question is to you, George, and it's a little bit of an open-ended one, so feel free to riff. And that's, is there anything that we did not cover about really getting at the core of how do you convince council members of things, since the council is really the end decision maker on a lot of these topics? Like, what are the things that advocates need to do that maybe they're not doing or they don't see because they don't have that perspective of a policymaker?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat restating what we've already said. Elected officials respond to the people they see and hear. And whether that's in a pandemic time over the video chat, or whether it's actually showing up in their office or showing up at a public hearing, all elected officials are cognizant of the human beings they've actually interacted with. That's human nature, and elected officials are humans. So you need to be heard if you care passionately. If you hold back, and Twitter and Facebook, I think don't matter. I think that they're discounted, and that the people who participate on them, elected officials, already pretty much know their opinion, the active participants. So I think there's no substitute for engaging in the process. And I just commend all of you, many of whom I've never met, that you're a new generation of people who care about your community and want to make it better. I mean, you can't cover all this in an hour and a half. It's a lifetime of work, and it can be enormously rewarding and it can be immensely frustrating. But you know, if you care and if you want to provide opportunity for others and be of service and speak up for your community and the things you believe in, Montgomery County is an awesome forum for that. It's a highly participatory environment that provides endless, unlimited opportunities for involvement and participation.
Yes, I was surprised when I first started to get involved in Montgomery County in college about how if I just showed up at these things, somehow by just me being a college student showing up at these events, I somehow got to know all the quote big players in Montgomery County very, very quickly. So really just showing up, even if you're not saying anything, being the face in that room, you're gonna be involved way more than a lot of other people, and have the ability to make your voice heard. So thank you so much to George and to Julio for co-presenting on this. It's really been great to work with you and with Montgomery for All, and specifically on this. So thank you to everybody for coming. And like I said, please feel free to reach out any time about these questions. There's no question that's too embarrassing or dumb to ask. That's my email up there. And coming up, as I said, Montgomery for All has monthly meetings. Our October meeting is going to be a testimony writing workshop. So we're going to very quickly put you into practicing what you have learned tonight. and figuring out how to participate in the public hearing process. And then you'll really put it into practice in November. On November 19th will be the Planning Board public hearing on Thrive 2050. So we really want to have a strong showing for that, to talk about the kind of county that we all want to see in the future. So don't forget, we'll send out a survey in the follow-up email to see how helpful this was. Hopefully it was helpful to you. This is our first time doing something like this. So hopefully it won't be the last. So hopefully you'll help us improve. And like I said, the email will also include a link to our advocacy manual that has a bunch more information. And we'll also include that survey. So thank you so much for coming tonight, everybody. This will also be posted on YouTube, and it was on Facebook Live, but feel free to share it with your friends and neighbors. All right, take care and stay safe. Wear a mask, everybody.
Thank
Have
you.
a great rest of your week. Thank you.